This webinar is organized by the emerging network Swedish Development Researchers, SweDev, to be officially launched later, as I understand it, but preparing to start this way. We're in the midst of a mini conference with this session as an open session, another open session tomorrow, which also form part of this mini conference. My name is Mats Hårsmar. I'm here in personal capacity to moderate the seminar. Otherwise, I work as Deputy Managing Director for the Swedish Expert Group for Aid Studies, the EBA, which is a government committee charged with evaluating and analyzing Swedish development cooperation. We are not part of the SweDev, but we have recently published a working paper on Swedish development research written by Cecilia Strand and a group of other authors from the SweDev. So for this theme, Swedish development research, historical perspectives and looking forward, we have with us an eminent panel. I'll introduce them as we go. They will talk for 10 minutes each. This will be followed by a very brief break before we move on to a panel discussion, which will take place from 3:45 to 4:30 approximately. Following that, we'll open up for questions, views, comments from you all. So please note your questions and queries as you go. You may use the wave hand function in Zoom, or you may write them in the chat function. You could also note that immediately after the presentations, we will open for questions of clarification on the presentations immediately after that. So write them down in the chat function if you have any. So first on out will be Fredrik Söderbaum. Fredrik, you're a professor in peace and development research at the School of Global Studies at Gothenburg University. You're also chair of the SweDev, is it board or a steering committee or whatever? But Fredrik, the screen is yours. Please.
Great. Thanks for the introduction and welcome. And I'm pleased to be part of this panel and grateful to the other panel participants for contributing to this important discussion. I will share my screen. I have a slide show. So I will try to answer the questions raised in the description of the roundtable by presenting 4 quick points in 4 slides. I hope to do it in less than 10 minutes, so I move on immediately. I hope you can see my slides, right? Yep. So sometimes there is a talk about that development is dead. My first point is that development is certainly alive. I see increasing talk about development and emphasis on development. We can see that in policy. The obvious example would be the Sustainable Development Goals. I don't think you can talk about the agenda and the SDGs without development, although sometimes we ignore the development aspect of it. That's another question or issue. I think that we do speak about development. I have been really excited about the discussion in the first session today about all the different educational modules and programs around Sweden. There seems to be a growing number of programs and modules dealing with development one way or the other around Sweden. There's an increasing number of students and some of them talk, of course, about the Agenda 2030, but also specific aspects. There is an quite impressive number of researchers talking about development. We in SweDev, we did the report Mats referred to. There was 580 answers in our mapping of the Swedish research community. And I just learned today that there are currently 820 mainly researchers on the sending list of the newsletter. And that speaks for itself, I think. There are other indicators we can talk about, but we don't have the time for it. My second point is that although there is an impressive number of talk about development, many scholars, researchers, teachers, policymakers, I would say that as a community and as a research community, it's dysfunctional. So, I mean, an alternative label of this slide would be why is SweDev needed? And we try to clarify that in the EBA report. It's a fragmented research community. It's weak, oh, what happened? Weak collaboration, failed information sharing, and just a general lack of knowledge and cooperation among different academic departments and researchers in the different subfields. And I think it's safe to say, at least from my perspective, that this undermines the quality of policy, it undermines the quality of research, and it undermines and contravenes the quality of education. So that's the basic motivation for SweDev. And here I want to add two more comments or reflections. Why would development researchers not collaborate? What's so special about development research in Sweden? Whereas most other subjects, disciplines, and themes see a benefit by collaborating. Similarly, what's so special about Swedish development researchers? All the Nordic countries and the many other European countries with the development research community, they do have networks or associations for collaboration. So I don't see what's so special about Sweden that we cannot have or should not have a network. So our response to this is general. We want to increase collaboration and links within the research community and improve dialogue between researchers and practitioners. And that would include better use of research-based knowledge in policy and for achieving Agenda 2030. So our strategy or priorities in the forthcoming 2 years is that we try to create knowledge and share information via a quite ambitious web page, newsletters, a member registry, and mapping of researchers and policymakers in order to increase knowledge about each other. We want to engage in a range of workshops, seminars, meetings, and policy dialogues. For researchers, teachers, and practitioners, or teachers and which could be at various levels. And researchers is a open category with which we are talking about a sub-network for PhD students, for instance, which have proved to be a rather beneficial exercise in many other disciplines. And it seems to be particularly useful in the field of development research because you have a large number of PhD students sitting in disciplinary or other academic environments where they are marginalized as development researchers. I mean, we don't have to speak about a single academic identity, but if they deal with development research in a monodisciplinary environment, they may feel marginalized and left alone. There might not even be competence for development research in their own academic department. That would create a gain to network with other, both senior scholars and other PhD students. There has been, my final point is that there has been contestation about what is development research in Sweden. Our approach is to have a general and inclusive approach to what is development research. And then, in our view, the network is open to all researchers, students, and practitioners in Sweden with an interest in development. In the Swedish context, we have had a debate about different strands of development, or what is development research. And we don't want to engage in any disciplinary gatekeeping. Our goal is to foster collaboration about development. And that can include if you self-identify as a development researcher, which can be disciplinary or interdisciplinary. Some people don't identify at all as development researchers, but they engage in development-related research or something else which they refer to as something disciplinary focus on less developed countries or something. And we do not want to exclude people or researchers or participants from these quarters. There much during the last decade or few years, there is increasing emphasis on research on Agenda 2030. Whether it's research on or for the agenda, it is relevant, I think, for SweDev, and they may find it useful to engage in SweDev. So we have an emerging website which is under construction, but you can find more information on how to become an institutional member under SweDev, or send an email to info@SweDev. So thank you for listening. I stop there.
Thank you so much. I right now don't see any questions for clarification in the chat function, but if there are, please write them down there. Otherwise, I'll move on to the second speaker, who is Veronica Brodén Gyberg. You are a research fellow at the Thematic Institution of Environmental Change at Linköping University. You have written about Swedish bilateral research cooperation and its history, among other things, in your PhD dissertation. So please, Veronica, what is your take on this theme? Over to you.
And I think that I will get some help with sharing. Yes, thank you, Anna. Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this interesting discussion, and I look forward to everything that SweDev will do. So my current research has moved a little bit away from this topic, but during a small part of my time, I'm working on turning my dissertation about the history of Swedish research aid into an updated book with Swedish Development studies. So I'm working on new material to bring it into the present. But for this discussion, I revisited some of my old work and also read some of the newer evaluations on the topic. I have a few points and questions, and depending on how we do for time, I might skip the last slide for now. But now we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So Swedish development research has been very much tied to Swedish research aid in general. And although funding and engagement has been diversified during, well, since the 1990s and not least during the 2000s, its broader history is of relevance as a backdrop for the discussions today. So that will be my entry point. In my dissertation, I explored a case of state-supported science for development inspired by, among others, Sheila Jasanoff. And I focused on the organization of SAREC, SIDA SAREC, or existed in different forms, both within and outside SIDA, between the 70s and 2008. I studied annual reports, evaluations, central policies, and I interviewed former directors. And I wanted to understand what socio-technical imaginaries about science in low-income countries dominated in each decade, how the role of science in development was portrayed over time in these policies and by directors, and how the role of aid actors and researchers were discussed. So I don't have time to go into too much detail here, but the beginning years of Swedish research aid were characterized by emancipatory ambitions with critical views of the aid actor role and discussions about dependency perspectives and focusing on the local context at hand. And in the 1980s, the discourse surrounding the role of research turned into a more pragmatic and slightly more in line with modernistic linear views of development. As the 1990s started, a focus on local context returned more through the discourse of sustainable development, but intertwined with these more universal views of knowledge and research, saying that knowledge is the same and applicable everywhere. So these logics don't necessarily exist in pure form in one place, but they can be traced throughout time. And I'll show you more about the discourses in the next slide. And this tendency of intertwining, I found, continued in the first decade of the new millennium, but more under the umbrella of the knowledge society discourse and innovation systems. So marrying a both localistic and universalistic view of the role of science in development. The number of documents have increased a lot in the time after 2000, and so I haven't really come to a conclusion yet what has been happening with these discourses in the last decade. It's something that I'm working on and will be working on during next year mainly. But maybe it has to be, we have to work beyond these assumptions and see what smaller breakdown of these discourses has been occurring. But the way the role of research for development is understood and portrayed does have consequences for what kind of modes of support are deemed relevant. So an interesting question to continue to investigate is therefore what the dominating views are today and what kind of consequences that can have. Next slide, please. So the discourses that I found in these documents they share the same point of departure, that modern science is a model for development and local national research capacity is necessary in order for this to be able to contribute to development. But the different discourses saw different ways of getting there, basically. For example, different values of disciplinary research versus interdisciplinary research. Which kind of research is considered more value-laden than others. are the approaches results oriented? Are we producing results that can be applied quickly for development purposes, or is it developing capacities for local knowledge and technology, more process oriented? Which priorities and interests dominate? Is it that of the donor country or the interest of priorities of the country in question, the collaborating country? And these tensions still exist, obviously. And high-income country actors can be seen as either experts and catalysts, or they can be seen as temporary assistants, for example. So there's a different degree of critique regarding the aid actor in these discourses. And how anchored in the past it is in terms of development theory also differs. How systemic the view is differs, for example. Okay, so the next slide, time flies. So this very complicated picture, I complicated it even more this morning, but my point is mainly to illustrate that there's a considerable tension between the two policy areas that constitute the principles that influence what, for example, research aid turns out to be. So this boundary spot that development research also inhabits because of its origins can either be seen as a strength or a weakness. So the policy that influences research aid, for example, is highly influenced by both the MFA and the Ministry for Education and Research, and therefore how much coordination is done between these two areas affects also the preconditions of research aid, for example. And I could see through the study that I did that there is a consistent tension between upholding what is it that is politics and what is science, and who's upholding the boundaries in different situations and contexts. So as a research aid actor, meeting both logics was a challenge throughout this time, and I can assume that it's still that way. And also, research bills have tended to place development research in the aid corner, even though there's been some sort of diversification in the last years. So the incentives for having more interaction have perhaps not been as strong. And history shows that foreign aid policy has tended to embrace research more than the other way around. So while the cross of the two political areas can be fruitful, they are driven by different logics. And one question we could ask is this still the case, and what kind of consequences does that have? And these are just some quotes from the different decades that I looked at that illustrate these tensions. And also, I'm going to skip the last slide, but we can talk about that in the discussion later. But this picture also illustrates that there are many actors and levels that influence both research aid and Swedish development research, which has traditionally been a part of that, even though now it's more diversified. Okay, I'll try to leave it there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Veronica. Very intriguing. We're quickly moving on to the next speaker, who is David Nilsson. And David, you are a director for the Water Center at the Royal Technical University here in Stockholm. It says you're a historian by training, but history of science, technology, and the environment is your field. But you've been writing about Swedish development research in various ways earlier. So please, David, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and I hope you can see my slides that I'm sharing. So yes, I have a little bit of a mixed background. I've been working in the private sector. I've been working as an aid bureaucrat at SIDA. I am now in academia. As you heard, I'm leading the Water Center, but the research I'm doing is mostly on low-income regions when it comes to socio-technical change, innovation. And I did together with a colleague back in 2017, together with Sverker Sörlin, we did write an EBA EBA report, which had the title Swedish Development, Research Aid Revisited. And so I guess that perhaps it's in that capacity I wanted to speak about the history and future of Swedish development research, which leads me to my first question. What is this topic really? Swedish development research. What do we mean? What do you mean? I am myself increasingly confused by this term, this notion of Swedish development research. And I mean, we can look at it many ways, but let's just try to narrow it down a little bit. And I think that we can agree that it's some kind of scientific activity. It is also something which is based in Sweden at Swedish universities and institutions. It is also presumably working with things that has to do with global sustainable development to do, and I think that's the kind of arena where I'm myself mostly operating at. But then if we take it further, then if we're looking at this as a subset, working predominantly with low-income regions, perhaps we also want to narrow it down to those particular countries which are eligible for SIDA bilateral support. And then finally, we get down to the very lowest level, which is the aid-funded contingent within those should we say, framings here. And I think that perhaps there's overemphasis on these last steps here, and that is going to be one of the should we say, one of my main contributions here is I want to question whether this can actually be a basis for a future when it comes to getting a lively research community, and I'll come back to that. So another question was, where do we come from? And we can start by looking at the disciplines that we are. And I think we can all agree that it's a multidisciplinary field. And we know that from our own experience, but also from the report, the so-called SweDev report, Strand et al., who did this survey, which I think is very illustrative of where the kind of multidisciplinarity. But there's also an argument that has been made that the kind of multidisciplinarity has expanded over time, that what once used to be a social sciences field has expanded into many other areas. But I think that if we look at some of the, what we know about earlier, from earlier studies of the field, for instance, the 1971 survey, which was part of the Swedish Commission for establishing the SAREC. We also know that already back then it was very highly diversified, and was not at all just about social sciences, humanities. In fact, it had a very high degree of science and technologies. So I think that in as much as this thing with the proliferation of disciplines could be a convenient type of explanation of underfunding or a fragmented research community, I don't think that argument would hold valid. Because it's actually always been like that. It is a multidisciplinary field, and it has not changed so much over time. So speaking about funding then, let us look at a little bit about the funding also, where we come from. And I think we heard from previous speakers also that much of the development research has been pitted in the, so to say, development aid corner. So the funding pattern has looked like this pretty much, that we start off with a 1% of the GDP, which is the aid framework. And then out of that stream, we get about 3% that goes to research, which mostly is about building research capacity in partner countries. Out of that stream, out of the 3%, we get another 10%. We actually siphon off 10% and we give it to Swedish universities. So that's a 10% of the 3% of the 1%, right? And this has actually been very stable over time. So we have seen in the report that I'm referring to, the one that we did together with myself and Sverker Sörlin, we saw that it had been more or less stable over the past 4 decades, ever since the 1980s. It has been like this. And even today, if we look at the aid framework for today, the aid frame, the development aid budget, the total frame is about 51 billion Swedish crowns for 2019. And if you take 0.3% out of that, then you get 150 million, which is almost exactly what Vetenskapsrådet allocated for last year. So that model seems still to hold through, and it's been, again, more or less the same. So we have a situation where we get 0.3% out of 1% of the GDP. And what can you expect from that? And I think that this is simply not something to build a lively research arena on. You get a weak, fragmented, and low impact research community out of that. And I think that numerous evaluations over the years have shown exactly that. So even back in 1985, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that evaluation that they did, it showed that this was a very relatively weak research environment, and they recommended a strengthening through concentration to fewer institutions. It was too weak and too fragmented at that point. 20 years later, we saw one of the evaluations saying that now, in fact, I had streamed or been able to channel more into fewer universities. So 8 universities captured almost everything of the return flow, which came from the bilateral programs, which is much bigger sum of money. So you see it's the Uppsala, it's Stockholm University, SLU, and actually more or less those that are also today the strong environments. That was fundamentally built in the 80s and onwards. So and again, at the same time, 26, there was another evaluation showing that although there were a few universities who dominated, they still lacked the critical mass and they couldn't attract the best researchers. And their recommendation, or Olle Edqvist's recommendation, was to strengthen excellence through channeling more through Vetenskapsrådet, which that was also what happened later on. But then 10 years later or so, there was another evaluation, and Mats, you are also one of the culprit behind this evaluation. It was also concluding that the synergies with the rest of the research and development arena in Sweden was very, very weak. So again, it still hadn't changed much in terms of research capacity in Sweden. So what can we say about this? Well, I think, again, it has been the same situation for 40 years. Again, it is simply too little to live on, but it's still too much for this kind of community to die. So it is keeping a kind of stranglehold situation on a research community that can't grow, but still can't really let go of what it has, if I say so. So, okay, so where are we going from here? Well, I don't know where we are going, but I think that at least we should be getting out of the sandbox and looking at the bigger picture, and that is what I think that we should do in this research community. And the big picture is this, that in Sweden, we have research and development every year at a completely different scale of magnitude here. In 2019, the R&D in Sweden was 171 billion Swedish kronor. That is including the private sector, obviously. So if you just look at the universities, it was about 40 billion kronor. But you should remember that a lot of the collaboration is also a lot of the work is also done in collaboration with industry, where you have a big chunk of that money. So obviously you can build a strong research community if you have 40 billion, not something else. I don't know how much is in this bracket, the Global Sustainable Development bracket within Swedish universities, but I can tell you it's quite a lot. Just look at Formas budget or Energimyndigheten budget and others. And still, we are clinging to this little, this kind of peanut, serving, which is 157. I think that is no basis for a future. I think what you can even say is 150 million per year is enough to support good research on the aid administration itself, but not on development, if that's what we're talking about. So what should we do? Well, I think that the only thing we can do, or we must do if we want to create a lively community, is to throw away the idea of development research. That identity, I think we have to let go of. And I think that we should, okay, this is actually, sorry, it was not this, okay. These are some programs that I have been working with myself over the past 10 years. And I can just say that we should look beyond these ideas of Vetenskapsrådet as a main funder. I mean, our arena is sustainable global development. And the reason is that without factoring in also low-income countries into that, there is no chance that we can have global sustainable development. So I think that we should rethink what we are in that sense as a global community. And in fact, we have come a long way, and we should make the most out of learning from that, but not thinking that things is going to change unless we rethink what we are. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much for this, David. Refreshing remarks. Now we have a fourth speaker whom I will introduce. If you could stop sharing your screen, perhaps, David, we could see Tomas Kjellqvist emerge somewhere on the screen. Hi. You are a researcher and project leader, if I get it correctly, at Södertörn University in Stockholm. Previously, you were head of SIDA's research unit, among other things. You've been active within UNESCO as well, and other functions. And you've written about Swedish development research as well in a PhD thesis, among other things. Please, Tomas.
Thank you. Yeah, I will now share my screen here and hope you see it. Yeah, I guess you do. So yes, thank you, Mats, and thank you other contributors in this panel. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to see that our fragmented community has found a hub where we can conjunct a little bit better. My heart is actually in research for development rather than development research, and I don't want to do a lot about this semantics, but really what I'm thinking mostly about is the research that is conducted in developing countries. That's why what I've been working mostly with, and which I also think is interesting. So today I will talk briefly about development. What is it and what has it to do with the knowledge base for development, and what are the capacities needed? And finally, what Swedish researchers can contribute to this. Like Veronica, I have a kind of historical idea here on how the history of development has played out. And I think what we have seen over the years is that development was once considered as a process, catch up on the GDP. That was in the 1950s, and most of the development research in that time was about this process. Then later we have moved on to more and more issues. The Human Development Index came as a complement to the GDP, and talking about the health standards, the educational standards, the living standards. And we moved on through the Millennium Development Goals to kind of structure the topics, the issues that were in development. And this Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals puts this even further. There is a huge range of issues that we can consider to be development. So knowledge in this context, when we were talking about the catch-up, the UN was discussing a lot of how could science and technology be applied for development. And this resulted in a world plan of action for the application of science and technology. What was at the core of that was capacity development in developing countries, but with the support of scientists in the developed countries. It was developed over a number of years. SAREC, as Veronica talked about, was funded during this period in the 1970s, where a number of other countries also started to take this World Plan of Action serious. The UN had a continued process on this, and this resulted in a Lagos Plan of Action for economic development in Africa as one of the continents. A fabulous plan which containing almost all the issues, but a very specific chapter on how science and technology should be developed. This was never implemented. Then came the structural adjustment programs, which serious cuts in the state budgets. And so all of the plans were actually just paper tigers. And it was all the way up to 2005, research was not an issue for development. It was only when the ECOSOC and Kofi Annan decided that science and technology was needed for the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. And happy to say, yes, in the Agenda 2030, we see that research, science, technology, innovation has a prominent place for the achievement of the goals. So research for development has actually come about. The sad things is that when I compare the Lagos plan of action with the wording in the 2030 agenda, it's like we are on a kind of repeat. It's the same phrases, it's the same things, it's the same technology transfer, knowledge transfer, etc. And to me, this is strange because what has happened in between, despite the budget cuts, is a lot. So in policy-wise, we are on a kind of eternal repeat. And I put in this musical science showing that the same sheet of music is playing around and around again. Or at least the conductors are there with the same piece of sheet, while the orchestra probably has played on a lot. And that's what I think we have to take stock of in a much better way. We are still talking about exhibiting indigenous technologies. Solutions must come from the local community. We are talking about technology transfer still. We are talking about technical cooperation. The Swedish bilateral research cooperation is part of this. And we are talking about the South-South cooperation and exchange of knowledge and experience among the African scientists and technologies. All these phrases are from the Lagos plan of action, but they are still as valid. And I wonder, what happened with policy? Didn't we reach further than this? Capacities for development, lots of wordings are spinning around. It's about PhD training, and we have somehow got stuck in that, I think. It's a little bit about postdocs, it's a little bit about building research councils and other institutions. So many words about what it's all about, and I'm still very confused about exactly. I can see that institution-wise, system-wise, these capacities are needed, but I don't see any systemic approach to how we actually can deal with it. Research management has been upcoming in the last 15 years, I would say. But when I look further into how SweDev has been working with it, very much by having university concept notes that are prepared for the SweDev research cooperation, on which calls can be made for the bilateral research cooperation. And I started to look into those comparing, and they are a little bit too much blueprints of each other. So I wonder, is this really connected to the development? Yeah, so, and if anyone would be interested in doing a critical discourse analysis of those with me, I would be happy to do that. So what can Swedish researchers contribute? I mean, we are very important to them as links to international networks in the bilateral cooperation. We are important as bridges to publications and so on. But mostly, I think we are important because we are friends, and we have made friends. And this is an asset that we could build a lot more on. I'm not sure that we are making any contributions to the academic community. Yes, we do, of course. We are writing our publications. But what do we give to the Swedish public? Have we contributed to better awareness of what development is about? Anyone who could seriously say that you have contributed to evidence-based development aid? That's a question I'm posing to you. I could seriously say that I have not. So these are things, and to me it sometimes seems that we are in a kind of loop here, even though things are moving. So my questions to finalize is, can we break out of this seemingly internal loop, and how can we do that? Thank you.
So thank you, Tomas. We are now at after 4 presentations here. I'm ready to take questions for clarification right now on any of the 4. Otherwise, we're in a Zoom setting, so we need to take a break. That will be a very brief break. We see a question coming from Jenny Lau Jørgensen. How do you see this role of action research in development projects? I don't think that is a question of clarification. That is something we'll take with us to later on. Thank you, Jenny. So we note that down. I will now announce a break for 3 minutes, not more than 3 minutes, but bring your coffee, do whatever you need, raise and shake a bit to be with us and active for the rest of this session. 3 minutes, we'll be back. It's very nice to see those familiar faces, many of them. Thank you for all your 4 valuable contributions here. We've seen that development research can take and has taken on various meanings over the years as the international trends have changed. So it has been a shift from the focus on natural development gradually towards international global development. The Veronica's the differentiation between the localist perspective and the Unitarian perspective. We heard Tomas talk about development for research where the subjects are at the center, if I understand you correctly, the development actors at the center. We heard David talk about a more thematic approach, if I may, where the perspective is much larger and we need to widen our thinking here and perhaps leave things by the wayside. And Veronica, your perspective on this over the years. So we have at least 4 possible interpretations. Research for development, as Tomas presented it here, related to low or middle income countries, a geographical focus of sorts. Development research, the second option, research concerning the concept, process or effects of socio-economic development more generally. It might also, for the third possibility, be research relevant for Agenda 2030, which is a global agenda related to survival of mankind. Or a fourth option, which is research financed over the Swedish aid budget, where we have the Science Council BR, the Nordic Africa Institute core budget, the Folke Bernadotte research section, the ICLD Knowledge Center grants, or SweDev bilateral research support programs, or perhaps even the EBA, even if we are not really a research funder. So Fredrik, the SweDev, you argue that you want to be inclusive, but do you need some boundaries And if so, what should those boundaries be? And if you have comments on the others, please raise that as well.
Yes, I think we want to be inclusive in order to escape these the particular polarization that sometimes emerges in the Swedish debate about who is a development researcher and not. And I mean, it's to some. I mean, David asks that we need to rethink what we are, but I think that he, at the same time, plays around with a few different concepts, which and distinctions, which may not apply to the thinking in development research today or SweDev. I mean, my last slide was about the fact that we didn't want to be exclusive. If you look at development research today is not about a particular group of country called less developed countries only. I mean, if you look at the debate about what development research is, it's about it takes a global perspective, and we can understand that by looking at comparing the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals was about resource transfers to poor countries. Sustainable Development Goals is about development worldwide. When I teach development research, the current paradigm is global development. Our field is even labeled global development studies in order to escape the artificial distinction between North and South. And as a consequence, it's not about SIDA's particular distinction of a particular group of countries. Because, I mean, I've discussed with, particularly with Vetenskapsrådet and about that distinction. They agree that the current distinction does not hold. It's useless. So that's one thing. Another thing is regarding the funding. Yes, we can talk about funding, but
let's come back to the issue of funding a bit later.
I leave it there.
Yeah, for now, I would like to hear David. What is your reaction to Fredrik's reactions here?
Well, I think we can agree that definitely the Agenda 2030 after, I mean, 2015, we have a global agenda. And that also applies to research community, obviously. So the question actually comes back, what is it then that you mean by development? I mean, in your presentation, Fredrik, you said development is very much alive and it's not dead, and that development aspects come up everywhere. But development of what then? Isn't it about development of, I mean, the global sustainable development? So why do we even need to narrow it down to what is this development research? Shouldn't we be fine just with the global sustainable development? And as I said at the end there, it is more a matter of trying to explain why global inequalities is a problem for sustainability. So it comes back to us as researchers to make ourselves relevant for those actors that are funding global sustainable development or just sustainable development, not about making ourselves relevant for SIDA or for someone specific institution in that is getting money from the aid allocation. So I think that it is more like, why do we then need to have such a, why do we need to call something development if it's not just about global sustainable development?
But aren't you excluding, David, aren't you excluding, for instance, the perspective of Tomas here, which was research for development with low-income countries, and you go to the global scene and sort of what do you think, Tomas? Are you feeling excluded by David's perception?
No, not at all. I mean, I think he has a point, and maybe this is why I'm a bit stuck with this policy explanation of what development research or research is. If we take this global sustainable development goals, it's so many issues, and what we are looking for are changes, improvements, transformations, etc., and which might be better words actually than development, because development to me is very closely connected to this 1950s idea of a very a kind of blueprint. This is the way countries should be developed. They should reach the same status and level as we are. So I'm a bit, I don't like the word simply, but talking about transformations is much more to me.
So basically, it's a problem with our understanding of the concept, which creates a confusion here, is it?
Yeah.
So there is something then that we could agree on. Veronica, what is your take?
Well, I think that it has to do with that big bubble of many actors and ambitions that exist in this bigger area. So it depends on who wants what actor wants what. I mean, is it, if we as researchers, I think I agree with that the focus on global challenges is appealing and smart, and the SDGs also lifts the importance of capacity building. So if it's capacity building, we want also, in addition to relevant global challenge research, then maybe we need better incentives from more funders to actually be able to collaborate with researchers, colleagues in low and middle income countries, because that's not made possible by maybe the current research bills or the last ones that have been. Then you end up in the aid corner, and that has one role to play, but there's a bigger picture. So I would say, who wants what? That's one thing. And then in terms of actually looking at the development cooperation and Swedish aid, there are possibilities there too, I would say, and I'm not an expert at how it is now, but I'm sure that, for example, SIDA could use Swedish universities, all Swedish universities, in a more pragmatic way, and engage in small scale and large scale aspects of bilateral collaboration and thematic international support, etc.
Yeah, thank you, Fredrik. You have worked up some energy there.
A quick reply. It seems to me that David says, if we call ourselves the Swedish Network on Global Sustainable Development, it would be okay. This is purely semantic. I mean, that's what we do our teaching about. But let's take one step further. If we speak about our interaction with policymakers, the definition of development or development research is meaningless. It doesn't matter to anyone. If we speak about education, then we may have a somewhat more narrow interpretation, because the benefit and needs are how to teach development and development research, or if you like, David, global sustainable development, which is what we teach. Our students today, what do they work with? Well, they don't work in Uganda. They work, our main job market today is Swedish kommuner and regions. They work with the implementation of the SDG. That's what we educate our students for. Then, if we speak about researchers, we want to exclude the definition where people say to us, well, I'm not a development researcher, but I research development.
Okay.
That's
David.
what we want to exclude. It's a never-ending debate, and Vetenskapsrådet and SIDA and others have invented what it seems to be like a Swedish definition of development-related research. And I can't find that in other countries. And to me, it's a illustration of the lack of dialogue about development research in Sweden. So it erupts.
David, you wanted in.
Well, yeah, there's lots of things coming up, obviously. And I think I liked what Tomas said about the idea of transformation rather than development. My problem with the word development is that it kind of holds it has a lot of historical baggage in a way, where we think about development as a very normative process, where there's always a goal, which is typically rich countries, right? So the transformation somehow would perhaps do a trick in trying to explain that what we need to establish global sustainable development is change, both in the rich parts of the world and the less resource-rich parts of the world, right? So obviously to solve that conundrum, we have to work together with researchers in developing countries, if I may use that word then. So the question, how do we get there? Regardless of what we call ourselves, how do we get there to create incentives for researchers in Sweden to work together with researchers in India, Bangladesh, or in Mali, or whatever, to establish that? So I think that, it's definitely already possible. I have, funding from Swedish funders like Formas, and I'm giving part of that money to research colleagues in Kenya and Uganda and other places, because that's the best way of doing the research. We have very interesting research questions. And I also think that there's something that is about to turn, and I hope it's about to turn when it comes to this ideal of that knowledge is best produced in rich countries and then transferred to poor countries. No, I mean, the knowledge we need is co-constructed together. And the only way to do that is to break out of this idea that development is something that you can somehow accomplish through mimicking or something, right? Which I still think is very much part of the debates.
Of course, the best development research is done along the end of rivers leading out to the Atlantic, as the saying went. But Tomas, I'd like to go to you here. I'm trying to be sarcastic, but I don't know if that worked. Tomas, you talked about, because it seems as if we are getting at something here. You were talking about this eternal repeat of science and technology, the transfer, which now David is onto as well. Why is it, do you think, that we are still in this situation? Why you see it again and again? Is it because of a structural problem in us researching their realities, or is that something which is reinforced by governments in these countries using that as a fundraising strategy in international negotiations, or is this something which is sort of a real thing, or something which is played out for other purposes? Why do we see this eternal repeat, do you think? If you
you have had so many interesting aspects on it there, and I think it's a kind of a conglomeration of various of those. I think even to me, who has kind of been in this so long and started on various occasions along this journey, question what is it that we are doing? Why are we imposing a Western Humboldtian university on developing countries? One question, why are the UN agencies, the World Bank, etc., talking about research and knowledge development in this way and not allowing for other models and so on? And I think especially in Latin America, there are various new constructs of how knowledge could be developed in other ways and so on. So I think to me it's more that I think we have to start debating are we part of this eternal loop? Are we upholding it? What kind of message could we give to the funders here, that you really have to change the way you are formulating the policies here and formulating the funding structures, etc. So, and I think it contains all of the questions that you raised about, but why it's there? Is there some kind of strategy somewhere? No, I don't think so. I think it's one of those things where we are constructing a system by our actions, and we'll simply get stuck in it. And I think it's time we try to break out by questioning, reflecting, etc. on what we're doing. But I think still, having said that, I think we are doing so much good things. I have seen so many interesting things happening over the years. So it's just harnessing the best of what we have done.
Fredrik, you wanted to come in, and then David and Veronica. Fredrik.
In response to David and partly to Tomas, I mean, the critique of Western-centric development, that's at the center of development research. And I don't know, I mean, we have debated post-development for 30 years, and it continues. It's what I see is that the problem with Western basic science and exploitation of scholars in the developing world, that's, I mean, it exists, but development researchers tend to have I would say, a more collaborative spirit in working together with people from the developing world, compared to when I compare them to some other disciplines and colleagues that I'm involved with. Most scholars at my department, for instance, of course, they have collaboration and they co-author with their partners in the developing world, and where they have collaborations. One problem here is that the structures of collaboration are pretty difficult today, which prevents cooperation as much as we would have wanted. So I don't really see the problems as David defined as that they correspond to development research. I see them elsewhere, and that development research actually take these issues seriously.
David, if you unmute, we can hear you better.
It works better that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I would have loved to agree on that there is what you say a critique embedded, a critique of Eurocentric type of approach or policy view on research and knowledge, and that should be at the heart of the development research. But I think that maybe that's at heart of development studies, which is a subdiscipline within social sciences, but it's definitely not at the heart of most of what is done in the broader definition of development research, which is development related, and which is about, you know, just doing things that are focusing on applications in developing or low-income regions. I think there's pretty much of that Eurocentrism left still there. But anyway, what I wanted also to say was that I think that I would like to say rather that right now it's quite interesting and there is an opportune moment, I think, now to be in this field of development / global development research, whatever, just because I think that we are beginning to see a reprogramming or so of this, what Veronica talks about as the universalist versus the localist perspective. And what I mean with that is universalist was always understood as universal knowledge is produced in the rich countries, whereas localist perspectives was about building capacity to absorb that. But I think that it has completely changed now. We already see a reversal of these knowledge streams. We see a lot of reverse innovation. We see a lot of grassroots innovation. We see a lot of ideas and knowledge patterns that actually find their way from just very recently were low-income countries. We're talking about Southeastern Asia, or we're talking about South Africa or West Africa or Latin America, places which are now actually knowledge producers, knowledge hubs in a completely different way. So I think that, you know, SIDA, SAREC and others have been doing a very good job to build capacity. And now it's the time to work with these environments. Now we can actually do it. So to kind of grab hold of that imminent reversal, I think, which is it's just around the corner.
Okay, Veronica, did you want to come in?
I had a kind of separate point, so I can wait if you want to.
Tomas seemed to be willing to react to something. We take that first, then Tomas, and then Veronica. Unmute yourself.
I mean, yes, we have this post-development discussion, etc., within some parts of the development research community. My point is that this is not reaching out. It's not influencing policies. It's not influencing the funding frameworks we are working with. So, I mean, how can we actually have this debate so that it reaches out to those who need to hear it? That's my simple point.
Thank you. Thank you. Veronica.
Well, I just had a point that I think it would be good, and I guess this also depends on what actor you are, but building on experiences from Swedish strategic internationalization of higher education. There are lots of interesting discussions going on in, for example, SASUF, the South Africa-Sweden University Forum, who are having a virtual conference right now and exploring ways of collaborating between low and middle income and high income countries, talking about decolonization and building new ways of collaborating with seed money, like small scale. So that could be one way to, speaking of creating entry points for different levels of researchers and engaging in different ways and new ways. I think it's welcome.
That's a practical suggestion how to move forward. Now we've touched upon the issue of financing. I think we should say something about that as well, because very often when talking about Swedish development research, we come into this: why is it so difficult to get funding from other sources than over the aid budget? And David, you would perhaps not agree to that this is true, but there's a conception, and there has been mention of sort of the mean interpretation as a second-class research, not living up to standards. The other interpretation is that there is a historical path dependency with institutionalized boundaries, saying that everything that is related to low or middle income countries should be financed by the aid budget. Please take it, and we're not touching that. Is this still true? And do you believe that there is something to any of these interpretations? David.
Yeah, well, I think it was quite interesting when we did this study a couple of years back. There was, prior to SAREC, there was, I wouldn't say a very strong, but there were a number of research communities around Sweden. I think there were about, when they did this survey in 1971, there was about 150 institutions across Sweden that actually responded and said they were doing development-related research. But then there was a lot of debate on, okay, so if we wanted to support research capacity in Sweden, where should that money come from? And as far as we could see, there was a clear indication that the Swedish regular funders saw that they didn't want to have the research, the development research as yet another competitor within the same budget. So when there was money available from the aid budget, then obviously that's where that was what was going to be the main source of funding. So there was kind of, it compartmentalized the funding arena in the 70s, and somehow it got stuck there. And then there has been numerous attempts to unlock and tear down these walls between the development funded research and the regular funding, which is much, much greater, right? But it has yet not really succeeded very well. Although we have seen, as I said, there's now lots of possibilities of actually getting funding from the other more regular streams. But it kind of cemented this. So on the question, is there still a logic? No, but it's just a sort of a historical, again, path dependency of some kind. But we don't have to stick there.
Okay, Fredrik.
Yeah, there is a lot to say about it in the EBA report. Of course, we are not exhaustive. I agree with David that there was a structure, historical structure, which has been reinforced. What we have seen is that scholars doing research on developing countries, they have had some problems to get funded through the regular calls in the disciplinary committees, because the disciplinary committees have said this belongs to development research. And that's the problem. The problem is not that we do development research, I would say. Now, I think we are seeing a process where development researchers, in the broad definition, attract funding from more and more funders. I am perhaps a little bit more positive, optimistic than David, in the sense that it seems that scholars dealing with development-related issues actually manage to attract some funding. However, they need to pitch their research in disciplinary frames, and they need to speak to general scientific debates. But there's much more to say about this. But I mean, we cannot rely on the funding through UFORSK. I mean, look at the last distribution of calls. Very few of funding. There are 12 research projects on an annual basis, and when I go through these scholars, very few are active in anything looking like a development-related academic environment. I mean, that can be seen as good. But when we rely on the expansion of scholars, we use the VR's own study, which was quite comprehensive, when they have made a study of all the applicants of VR UFORSK. So there is an expansion of applicants from different disciplines, both in social science and beyond. I mean, that is obviously not the only funding mechanism that we can deal with. But that was the evidence for that, for the expansion. I mean, then we can go on and discuss boundaries here and there.
Okay.
Much more could be said. Yes, stop there.
Veronica, you wanted to come in?
I guess it's a repetition of the path dependency in research bills as well, and it keeps development research, if you want, whatever you want to call it, in that corner. So I don't know how it's looking in the current work with the new research bill. I know that the global challenges and the SDGs were raised in the last one, but as a way of facilitating more collaboration and funding to our colleagues in low and middle income countries, it would be good if the other funders explicitly encouraged that as part of what they enable. So to make it more explicit. Otherwise, I think the pattern of collaborating with other high-income countries will continue to dominate.
Now I have David who want to come in, and perhaps Tomas as well. I don't know. Yes. If that is the case, I think Tomas could go first. Please, Tomas.
Yeah, I mean, I can only talk about what's on my wish list when it comes to funding, and that would be a broader possibilities to actually make collaborative research, because we now have sufficient partners outside in the world, in the low and middle income countries, and the opportunities to really harness that would be excellent, and that I think requires a total retake on the funding structures now.
Okay, David.
Well, yeah, I wanted to pick up on the question of attracting funding through the regular structures. And I think that, Fredrik, you have a point there with the committees. I mean, the expert groups that are assessing the applications, of course, they will have to make an assessment based on, you know, they're often structured in disciplinary committees. But I think also that it is kind of something that we could take as a challenge upon ourselves, us in the development research community, if I say so. Of course, we have to speak to what is scientifically relevant. We can't get around that. So, and I think that's not really that, it's not something that is difficult for us, given the fact that we know a lot about global sustainability. We know about this kind of transformation and what it requires. And we have something to contribute which other disciplines or other, shall we say, research communities cannot. And that is to have that kind of dual perspective of the low-income regions, so to say. So I think that there's plenty of opportunities to do that. But again, we have to challenge ourselves. We have to live up to those expectations, to formulate the questions in a way that they are answering things that are scientifically relevant outside of what is the normal development policy kind of discipline.
Now thank you. Now we're getting closer to the moment where I let in some questions and comments from every participant here. You can right now do as Ingrid. Did you raised your hand, Ingrid Öborn? She has raised her hand, or you can do as Cecilia Strand. Write your question in the chat room and we'll pick it up. But before I'm letting you in, I will ask another question to the panel. As I understand it, there was at times a historical decision to keep development researchers in their respective disciplines to ensure research quality. And that has, over the years, then contributed to some of development researchers or research on development being isolated or lonely in what we see as a fractured field here. What avenues can be walked to solve that? Should it be collaboration? SweDev is promoting collaboration here. Is it collaboration for raising research quality, or is it to raise the collective strength of this field, like a trade union of sorts? Anyone who has an idea about that? Fredrik.
Yes. It's a very good and relevant question, and I think that I more or less face that on a not daily but a weekly basis. And our solution at my department, and I think that's relevant for SweDev as well, is that there is something called double identities. or multiple identities and dual self-identification. You can be a development researcher at the same time as you are a political scientist doing political science research on development. Therefore, the trick is not to engage in disciplinary gatekeeping and say that it's reserved, that you have to choose your own academic identity. I wonder if that was that was the answer to your question, but I think that is the debate that we have faced in establishing SweDev, and we want to escape it. It's to some extent semantic and not productive in our view. Yeah.
I don't see any very eager hands waving now, so therefore I would like to ask Ingrid.
Yes, I've been waving.
Someone's waving.
Jonas Ewald.
Jonas, okay. Okay, Jonas and then Ingrid in that case.
I think Ingrid was first. Let her, you could go first.
Okay. My screen is a bit too small to see everyone, but so therefore, raise your hand. But Ingrid.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I came in a bit late, so maybe I missed a few things, but I came in timely to hear Tomas Kjellqvist saying that collaborative research would be the next step. And I really agree. So I'm coming from SLU, maybe I should say that, but also chair of the VR Development Research Committee that I also heard that you talked about a bit when I just entered. And I mean, what I think we should push for, and that means that we need like a new strategy and slightly different instructions from what we have today. But of course, that's not impossible if we work jointly on it for the future. But really have collaborative research where both Swedish and research collaborators in the south or wherever we want to work can apply sort of together on equal terms and be funded for the research, instead of having like one channel of money for the capacity development, that it's called, and the rest for the Swedish research base doing development research. I think that's very old-fashioned style, and we really need to change that. And I think in reality research have started to change it, but not because the structure facilitates, but because we do it, we apply from formas, we give more money to them than we maybe are supposed to do from the projects we get and so on. So I think that's really one thing. And just another thing, someone said that it was only 12 projects approved by the VR development research. That's not really true. It was 30 projects granted last year, and it will be possibly 35, 37 granted this year, in addition to the international postdocs and Swedish Research Link. So it's not a lot of money, but the budget has actually increased for this year. So that's at least a good news. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Jonas Ewald.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Jonas Ewald from the New University, Peace and Development. It's really such a rich panel and so many different and very inspiring different perspectives. And there's so much things to say, but I'm just reacting on a number of things. I'd like to try to bind it together. I think that the challenge here is that we are describing research for development or development research or global sustainable development as it is one field, and we all know it's not. It's almost now, particularly if we bring in all these other dimensions, we are describing a very vast field. It's almost like science in general. And I think maybe we are too ambitious if we're trying to find one definition of what it is. I think we have to be open-minded, as Fredrik emphasized, that not gatekeeping in a way. And the other thing is, what I find a bit difficult here is this paradox, which I think has been very beautifully illustrated by different of the panelists, that the dilemma on the one hand, the need to do what have traditionally been ethos of development research is to be field-oriented, to have deep knowledge about local conditions, about the specific settings in different contexts where development or transformation is supposed to take place. And on the other hand, then, the demand on connecting and being able to compete with general scientific debates in the field And to find the right balance there is really tricky, because the general scientific debates in the field are completely dominated by United States and the EU countries so far, if you look in what is published in different journals. And on the other hand, then we have all the developing countries that are struggling to get published, but have difficult to do that. So, and for us then, we try to do development research. We also know how extremely time-consuming it is to do this type of collaborative research and field-oriented research. And I think, in a way, we need to bring that into the discourse when we discuss also how to do development research and what is good criteria for what is good development research. And I really agree with the points that have been made here about the need for rethinking the funding structure, so it's more easy to finance collaborative research on the one hand, and on the other hand also to acknowledge how time-consuming it is to do research in complicated countries in rapid transformation, often with very poor infrastructure, very difficult context. And lastly, which I think is important here, which was very well described by Veronica's very confusing but illustrative image about the ecosystem. And I think that's a good point. We're really talking about the ecosystem of development research in Sweden. Here, where we have a lot of different actors, different universities, different policy units, and different actors, different organizations. And again, here we have to bring all this together. And I think when we talk only such a thing as policy, it's not only development aid policies. I mean, it's also security policies and sustainable related policy. And as Fredrik mentioned, many of our students now work with integration issues in Sweden. So we have so many different policies also to relate to when we talk about policy relevance. So to me, to end up, I think when I reflect over the discussion we've had here so far, I feel like one of these wise Indian men that are trying to describe, or one of the 5 Indian men trying to describe the elephant development research, and we all look at it from very different perspectives. And I think here we must be open for having, on the one hand, a critical perspective, which I think is very important to reflect over what is development for whom and all this. And at the same time, be able to be pragmatic in other corners of the same field. And I don't think we can agree on that development research must only be field-oriented, should only be critical, but it need also to have this more pragmatic dimension.
So thank you so much. There are a few questions on the chat function. I can read one from Jenny Jorgensen to the panel. How do you see the role of action research in development projects? That was an early question. So we have sort of moved many, but when you comment on what Jonas and Ingrid said, please bring that question also up somehow. Anyone wants to reply from the panel? David?
Yeah, I think it ties nicely in with several of the comments made now, including Jonas, which I think beautifully illustrates that we have more or less an impossible task, because we are supposed to do, as you said, deep knowledge, which is situated knowledge, at the same time tying or linking that to the universal knowledge level and the science production, and to be excellent researcher in every respect, obviously. So that is definitely very, very difficult. And one of the comments I saw here was about, it's not just about the global scale, but multiple scales, right? So definitely we have to have that approach of being able to work locally and do the kind of practical, or what shall we say, the action-oriented research, but then still to be able to connect that to some kind of global level universal knowledge. And maybe that is what is making it so difficult also for the research community to excel or to get heard or whatever, that we have to do things that no one else is asked to do. So I'm just throwing it out there. Is asking too much of ourselves?
Well, as they say, it's not rocket science. It's much more difficult than that. Tomas, you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think also Jonas' comment was very good, and I was also encouraged by Ingrid saying that it would be possible to change the structures here a bit. And I think that also connecting back to what you said, should we be a trade union? Yes, in a way, I think SweDev could be a trade union. This could be a very good way of actually saying that we are 800 researchers in Sweden who would like to have a different kind of funding structure. Which would emphasize different things, and still having this, broad way of thinking of development research. And I don't think we should get stuck in the semantics here at all, because I think at the heart we are very much on the same lines. But I think also that we might use the network to have more cooperation between different types of research. I mean, the field researchers are one type, and then we might also have those who could address more towards the global scientific community and so on. So utilize each other, collaborate more also within the community in order to achieve more. I think that's one of my responses.
David, you come in again.
Yeah, I saw, but someone else maybe have been waving before, no? Yeah, you're the chair. You're giving me the word. Okay.
I'm giving you the word, and I will let someone in after you. Yeah.
Yes. I was thinking the network, what can it contribute, rather than saying that, because the question came up, should there be boundaries? I mean, should they have some kind of definition? But I guess the question is rather what kind of value can it contribute to its members, right? And obviously, I think the tricks of the trade and the way the trade is changing is going to be really what is needed. I mean, the good examples of the researchers who have been able to do this impossible juggling act, how did they actually do it? To have ongoing, practical, action-oriented research going on together with local universities or research partners in developing countries, and still being able to bring something out which is of scientific excellence and convince some funders. Of course, there are those examples, but let's talk about them. Let's talk about how to do this in a changing world, rather than saying that it used to be like this before, now it's much worse, blah, blah, blah. So focus on how to build a strong community by showing the tricks of the trade.
Okay, now I have some comments on the chat function, and I don't know if Cecilia Strand would like to come in and state your questions, or should I read them?
Sure, no, I can certainly, I didn't know exactly how you wanted to, if you wanted to cluster questions or how you wanted to do it.
Yeah, but
so I'm kind of very been listening to various speakers talk about funding structures and funding challenges and how that has changed or not so much changed over time. But I'm curious to sort of how Sweden and funding opportunities for development or development related or transformation related research, whatever you want to call it, how do we compare to other countries with sort of like-minded ambitions to support development research both at home and in our partner countries? Are we an odd country, or how do we fare in sort of an international comparison?
So, Fredrik, did you have another question as well, Cecilia, or?
I mean, that's kind of a different question, so.
Yeah, state that at the same time, and we'll take.
All right. I was curious when I was listening to Thomas, because he was kind of describing, or at least alluding to in development, and I at least picked up, and I don't know if that's my hearing, but arguing for some sort of disruption of this eternal loop, how to get out of this merry-go-round. But I never really picked up. So who do you see as possible disruptors? Is it this network that is now emerging in Sweden, or I mean, who are the potential agents to push this change? So those are my two questions.
No, thank you so much. I think Fredrik might start answering the first question about whether we are an odd country, and then Tomas is thinking about the second, and Jeanette Vähämäki will come in after that. Please, Fredrik.
Yeah, thank you. Sweden is an odd country in two regards. One is that we have very little funding through the universities to lecturers who can do research. I, as a professor, have some research funding. Otherwise, it's channeled through external sources, and where you have to compete for these external resources all the time. So if I talk to a development researcher in Denmark or Norway, he can undertake development research as part of his duty. He has freedom to choose. That's more restricted in Sweden. However, if you compare the funding sources in Sweden for development research, they are much higher compared to Nordic countries, because they don't have the same funding system. So in a sense, there is more funding in Sweden to compete for, but the competition is pretty stiff. And according to VR, the number of applicants from different disciplines and subject fields has expanded considerably. And that's what we mention in the EBA report.
No, I'm aware of the EBA, sort of the Nordic comparison. I'm pretty aware of what, because we've discussed that in many meetings. But if you look beyond the Nordic region,
well,
UK,
it's same
Germany,
thing in England. You have, if you're at a good university, you can undertake research within your lectureship. If you're at a low-ranked university, you have much less research time.
Okay, and to a question here, externals are allowed to comment. Yes, very much so. But I'll come back to that question. But first, Tomas, then Jeanette, and then a question from Madeleine Fogde. Tomas, please.
Yes, I think this problem of being in this eternal loop, that we have a policy views and also the pragmatic funding views are so stuck. That's part of a problem that we as development researchers have not studied the role of knowledge and research sufficiently. There's very little research on what this actually has been doing for development. So how can we influence policies if we do not have the research results to really show? That's part of the problems. I think we could actually get those results pretty quick, because they are accessible in various ways, and we could also try to persuade the donors to give us some funding to do it. But I think we as a community have a possibility, because we have so many experiences that we could share. The question is only how to organize this, and this is why I was kind of interested in the idea of thinking of SweDev as a kind of trade union. We have a number of experiences and interests that we could put forward. So that would be my response. We could do that together.
Okay, I think Jeanette Vähämäki is next on my list.
Thank you so much. And just to introduce myself, I'm at SEI, and I'm the project manager for SweDev at the moment, and was part of writing the EBA study. And currently, and the seminar tomorrow will be on how practitioners and policymakers, when do they pick up research, and when is like research relevant to that? And I think that the question posed here on action related research, and David's idea on actually kind of really looking at like, when is research becoming actually relevant for practitioners, and what are the change stories? When do we actually reach out to practitioners? That's a really important question that SweDev really wants to dig deeper into, because it's quite clear that there's so much research out there which is never used, but when is it actually used, and when is someone doing something? So definitely thanks for the idea and the question here, and maybe we could do a seminar only on that question at a later stage. From the EBA study, that it was very clear that researchers felt that there was very little practitioner engagement, and that was something to promote. Also further funding opportunities, so funding also for research calls where practitioners and researchers kind of jointly come up with research ideas that which is more practitioner relevant, where they come from that. So that was one of the recommendations from that. Then funding is also one of the questions that SweDev is digging deeper into, and probably we could do maybe a study on looking at broader international comparisons and how the funding environment is. What was apparent in the EBA study was also that, and the reason for why SweDev was only focusing on Swedish development researchers is that there were actually quite many who said that yes, there are funding opportunities for Swedish researchers to collaborate with development researchers in the developing countries. However, the travels between Gothenburg and Sweden, and how do we kind of in between us collaborate, those funding, we don't see so many funding opportunities for that. So that's the reason for why SweDev currently is kind of focusing on the Swedish development researchers, those who are based in Sweden, so that we get to know more about what we are doing here. And maybe a second step would then be to collaborate more and increase the funding opportunities, also to collaborate with researchers in development countries. But currently, as said, many felt that there exist opportunities from SIDA and also the Swedish Research Links, and so to have collaboration with researchers in developing countries, but not among Swedish development researchers.
Okay, I'll let Madeleine Fogde, do you want to put your question yourself, or shall I read it?
If you can hear me, yeah.
Yes,
so
I can hear.
my name is Madeleine Fogde, and I run a number of networks, or I've been running for a couple of years, and many of those networks has actually been linking researcher up to practitioners and policymakers. I myself is not a researcher, so I might be swearing in the church, and I apologize for that. And I haven't the full background on this network. However, it interests me because I see potentials for collaboration, and as we have already quite vibrant and active research practitioner policymaking networks existing in some disciplines. But I mean, it has also been taking, I tend to agree a bit with all of you, but looking at it from the countries where you are doing research, there is such a development the last decade. In the 90s, it was forbidden to invest in higher education and research, but this is not the case any longer. So, but then the collaborating researchers, of course, they are have a totally different day-to-day operations than you might have. And so it's this kind of challenge and also opportunities to harness this in the future for the network, which interests me. And how are you dealing with that part? And from another perspective, since I have the opportunity to work between sectors and be so broad, I see there's really big difference also from discipline to discipline. So how it's interesting also to see how you will work with that. I think seems like it's more natural for some disciplines to have these natural collaborations, like maybe for agriculture and water. I'm not sure, but that's kind of from my perspective, at least.
Thank you, Marianne. Is there someone from the panel who would like to react to anything of what has been said? Otherwise, I have more questions to come. So if you can hold your horses there. I have Marcela de la Torre Castro. Would you like to pose your question?
Oh, my camera is not working. Thank you very much. Really interesting afternoon. I was surprised that you were using the term transformation in this panel, because to me transformation is really related to the resilience discourse, and the resilience discourse is, as I see it, another line of research that is trying to come up in the development issues at the moment, and they are actually taking a lot of the money that is putting in the research. So is this kind of an instrumental thing to go into that direction, or is there any other reason that you are using transformation? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think I'd let Elisabeth Olivius on here, because you have sort of kind of commented or responded to that question, haven't you?
Sure, thank you. No, I think maybe this is a bit of a sidetrack in this seminar, really, but I also started thinking about the kinds of places where I've heard the term transformation used recently. And in my experience, I've been thinking about that it seems to become really popular among climate and environmental researchers, which and paired with sustainability. So it's sustainability research, transformation research, which sounds really exciting and really broad. I mean, if we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, that should be about a range of different issues. But then in reality, it's still just about environmental and kind of climate change issues, which then becomes problematic if that one part of a development, transformation, sustainable development agenda kind of colonizes the whole field. And we could just look at Formas and their funding, for one example, about how sustainability is marketed as something broad, but then in reality it's just environmental issues. So it was just my reflection on kind of the politics of that. I'm not sure what the politics of that term is, but it seems to have become popular and kind of used in puzzling ways recently.
Yeah, thank you for that. David, you wanted to comment on this? So.
And I did already in the chat, actually. So anyway, no, but it is a widely used term in policy, and it is no coincidence that the high-level panel of the United Nations in 2015 actually labeled their own report a transformative agenda, right? So it is very much about transformation, also in the United Nations policy debates. It has been extremely influential in the EU research and development policies, where it somehow is blending in together with the grand challenges agenda. So, and I don't think maybe we should have a big discussion of what goes in under transformation and sustainability transitions and so on. But I think it is it would kind of be smart to align also with that kind of vocabulary somehow, also for what is known as development research.
On the alignment discussion, yeah. My suggestion now is that we start with a suggestion which comes from Lisa Roman, and then we move from that suggestion into a final round by the panel, where you will have to answer the question, what positive contributions or what suggestions do you bring with you from this debate, or could you offer to the further work of the SweDev? Positive proposals, suggestions, etc. in your final 1 minute round comment. And Lisa Roman first.
Well, thank you. I appreciated this discussion, and I understand that there are many different issues discussed here, both the development relevant research, which is a broad field of topics, and then this specific research on development and who owns those questions, etc. But my suggestion was only that also researchers from other countries and in particular from low-income countries which we are discussing here, should be invited to this kind of discussion. and so that we can understand better, put the Swedish research in that context. If we advocate collaborations, I mean, it would be interesting to hear if this is also of interest to collaborating partners, or what are the difficulties and the possibilities with such collaborations, and understand better these researchers' needs.
Okay, good suggestion. Thank you very much. We now move in the reverse order. So I ask Tomas Kjellqvist, do you have a final comment here?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to this, because it has been very intriguing hearing about the panelists and the questions emerging here. And what I take away is we shouldn't get too stuck in semantics, but rather reflecting on what we mean when we use different words, and do that both internally and in debates, and trying to get as concrete as possible. I like Lisa Roman's idea as well, but I can also see kind of methodological issues on how do we do this in a way that it's not just another donor country intervention. So I think that might be my takeaway. How do we get a really mutual collaboration going?
Thank you, Tomas. David, what would be your takeaway or suggestion?
My takeaway would probably be that I have to think. No, it's kind of it is a multifaceted question we are dealing with. We are having so many contributions, all very insightful. I think we share the feeling that something is not right. Something should be done. There is a need for a disruptor, but exactly who and how, I think that still is somehow hidden. But I can encourage SweDev to look at those precisely those critical questions, and not just becoming an emissary, a club of representation to press for more money or something like that, but actually look at what can we do differently, because things have been actually looking more or less the same for too long.
Thanks. Veronica, please.
Thanks. I also agree that Lisa Roman's idea is very good as part of a next step in looking at this ecosystem that you said, Jonas, the bigger picture of all these actors and different definitions of what development-related research or development research can be from their perspective, and how it can be supported and developed. I think it would be really interesting to hear and discuss with the different actors that, good, lots of good stuff for this network to work on with.
Thank you so much. Fredrik, over to you.
Yes, I'm very excited about the seminar and the different perspectives and views. I take with me that we have that development inspires, that we do have intriguing and exciting debates. And I take with me that there are different sort of avenues or parallel tracks to work on. I mean, we need to work with the collaboration among researchers. We need to work on strengthening dialogue between research community and the practitioners. We need also to cater for education, and to some extent, these definitions or views about what is development here is not necessarily the same in all these tracks. But that I don't see a main problem here with that.
Okay.
So I see exciting future for collaboration and networking. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank you all for giving so much energy and engagement, which I sense here. It's a lively field, however, very difficult to define what it is. And there is a need to break out of some things, as been clear here, and move on and move forward, which is a very positive thing. Tomorrow, those of you who are longing for more time on Zoom, you have not had enough. So you have your chance tomorrow at 9, because there will be another public event in the mini seminar of SweDev. It will be representatives from Foreign Affairs, SIDA and Concord, and a discussion on how development research is used by practitioners and policymakers. So right now you should be able to see, if you have not registered for that, there is posting in the chat function by Jonathan Eng, where you find the link to where you can register for tomorrow's seminar. So that will be open for a few minutes. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining, and thank you for contributing to everyone.